a prolific author of articles and reviews. When not in Africa, Jack and his wife Nancy live here in Charlottetown, where they're very active in the heritage and in the Christian community. And we welcome Nancy as well, who is here again to give support with the PowerPoint presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jack Whytock.
Thank you very much, Sean, and also to the crew that are helping with our technical support and Nancy here this evening. It's a delight to be back with you during this special Heritage Lecture Series. And for those of you who were here last week, you will recall that we were dealing with the 7 streams of Presbyterianism and also 7 cultures and 7 unions. So 7 was the key number from our talk there last week. This evening is going to be quite different. We're going to be looking at something that's very interdisciplinary in our lecture. And we're going to look at 3 things all coming together in this lecture this evening. We're going to talk about theology, which is the study of God and His Word, but also we're going to look at liturgics. Liturgics is how one worships publicly, and the elements of worship, and the circumstances and the place of worship. So worship and liturgics is going to be part of our discussion this evening. How have Presbyterians worship? Secondly, we're going to look at something called aesthetics. That is that sense of beauty, that sense of wonder when we worship. The third thing is church architecture. That is the use of a building or a place or a building space and how that affects liturgy and aesthetics. So those 3 are going to be our theme this evening. And then what I'd like to begin with tonight is I want to talk about how Presbyterians have shifted the way they have worshiped the Lord from about 1820 to about 1920. And it's going to, in a sense, set the context for the Kirk of St. James, but also for the wider Presbyterian movements of North America and globally. And so I'm going to do a little bit of teaching here, if you don't mind, first, and then I'm going to illustrate our points a little later so that we can sit back, but just to bring us together. So the first thing I want to talk about are the shifts by Presbyterians liturgically, how we worshipped between the 1820s and the 1920s. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the United Kingdom or whether you're in North America. Those shifts were all taking place. There are 3 things that happened during that 100 years that greatly changed Presbyterians. For about 200 to 300 years, Presbyterians had not changed the way they worship. But during this 100-year period, Presbyterians underwent radical changes in worship. And the 3 things that were changing, the first one was to go from tables to a table. The plural and the singular is absolutely important here. I'll just lay the 3 out and then I'll talk about them. The second one is to go from a cappella singing, that is with no instrumentation, to accompanied singing. When we talk about a cappella singing, it would be singing with a presenter, and it would usually be line by line, lining it out and then singing it back as a congregation. But that shifted to accompaniment with an instrument. And then the third one was from plain worship to adorned worship. These 3 things encapsulate 100 years. And so for 15 minutes or so, I'll take you through 100 years in my efforts to do that. Going back to 1560, the Scots radically changed the way they had communion. It went from an altar to communion tables down the main aisle of the church, in which everyone sat around the table.
As that happened, approximately 30 to 50 people sat at each communion table. As that happened then, a congregation would go through relays of several tables. A large congregation, up to 7 times they would come forward. The Scottish Presbyterians were absolutely committed to tables in the church, not a table. They were willing to spend money on having several tables. So it was a point of theology. When the Scottish commissioners went down to London to Westminster Assembly to help write the Westminster Confession of Faith, for 3 solid weeks, the Scottish commissioners held up the proceedings of the Westminster Confession being written because they insisted that it had to be tables and not a table. So for 3 weeks, they argued theology over having several tables in the church, not a table. A compromise was reached. It almost sounds like a Jesuit compromise to me. It says, in the end, yes, they can gather at the table or around the table. Now, that's a good Jesuit way of saying you could be around any table depending on how you interpret the distance. So it was a compromise, but the Scots went back to Scotland and they were adamant that it would only be at the table, not around a table. And so that was the Scottish practice. And what they built were trestle tables. You know what a trestle table is? Usually has a cross in it like that. You can fold it up quickly. And all those tables would be stored somewhere in a barn or something, and then they'd be brought out once a year, and they would be either put down the whole center of the building, or they would be across one of the aisles. And so that's how it works. So they had their trestle tables. When churches got a little more sophisticated, they had hinged tables. And what a hinge table is this: all the way across the front of a church, on this rail, you would put hinges and a board, and the board could be dropped down when it wasn't communion. When it was communion, you lifted the board up, then people could sit all the way across the front and put a second row of seats or bench, and they could sit there. Easy to get 50 people sitting at a communion table. So that's what the Presbyterians were doing until 1824. When the huge controversy broke out in Scotland over the tables. And you thought it was the organ, but we'll come to that one. The first controversy was the tables, 1824. It was at St. John's Church of Scotland in Glasgow. Who was the leader of the controversy? Well, we saw his name last week, and you may be surprised at this man being the controversialist. His name was Thomas Chalmers. He was the minister of the Kirk at St. John's in Glasgow, and his congregation was overflowing. And he had a problem on the Communion Sunday, once a year. How do you get all the people in the church to be able to sit quickly at those tables without it going from literally 8 a.m. in the morning until 5 p.m. in the afternoon? His solution was radical. We will sit around the table by everyone remaining in their pews to receive communion. Well, that was 1824 and 1825 when the great controversy arose there. And there was a man who immediately began to challenge him. His name was James Begg, B-E-G-G, Sr., who immediately wrote a famous book against what Chalmers was doing and what others were doing, and declared it a heresy in the Church of Scotland to be sitting at your pew taking communion. Why? Because you were not looking in the eyes of the fellow communicants. You were looking at the back of someone's head when you commune. Now you might say, well, I can't believe my forefathers would do that, but anyhow, such is history. History has a lot of fascinating things. It was taken to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1825, 1826, 1827. And the General Assembly went back and forth on this, and they finally came up with a compromise. Industrial Glasgow has such large congregations, we will permit them to continue to do this in the pews, but no new congregations that are being built with buildings can do this. So they produced a good Presbyterian way of saying it. Ordinarily, all Presbyterians will sit at tables when they have communion, but there could be an extraordinary situation such as industrial Glasgow with those massive congregations. So we will allow St. George's, the Tron, and St. John's to have pew communion. But it was not without incident. And so for about another 80 years, it was still the norm to have tables rather than going to a table. That was the first controversy. After 1900, the shift was there. Lowlanders were going to the pews for communion, sitting there. The Highlanders still were holding out very much for tables. That was the first one. The second one, a cappella, to instruments. Again, it's amazing how Glasgow figures in this talk tonight everywhere. Glasgow seemed to be the place where there was a spirit of change. 1807, the very first organ ever to be played in a Presbyterian church in Scotland, the Kirk, was played at St. Andrew's Church, Parish Church in Glasgow, 1807. Well, I think it survived maybe one Sunday. Then the presbytery was asked to intervene. The presbytery intervened, and the organ was removed from the church. It looked like the organ controversy was over. Well, of course, you know that such things die hard in these things. The presbytery made it very clear. This was the decision and edict of the presbytery. The use of organs in the public worship of God is contrary to the law of the land, that is, the civil magistrate, established by the Kirk, by the covenants, and to the law and constitution of the established church. There will be no organs in the Kirk, by magistrate and by the constitution of the assembly. But people continued to agitate, and there were 4 reasons that they wanted organs in their churches in the 1860s to the 1880s. Reason number 1. Theology had begun to challenge the old teaching and saying, prove to us that this is a biblical mandate, that there is no reason that you can, or why you cannot use the instruments in worship. We want it proven to us from the Bible. Secondly, musical tastes were starting to change in the Victorian period. And those musical tastes were impacting culture and all those things. Many theaters were much more musical, all of that. There was also a sense of aesthetics that was growing. The Scots were getting tired of singing 12 tunes in church. Many Scots were getting tired of hearing the presenter sing or chant out the line and then have to wait to sing the psalm because they could all read. And so there was a sense of there's no beauty in this music. It drags and it's going on forever. The fourth one was, there are some Presbyterians in England who are using organs. And so there's a precedent. If the Presbyterians in England can get away with using organs, why can't Presbyterians in Scotland use organs? And so there was this discussion, but there was one other reason. Scotland was having a problem. There was another denomination that was growing in the mid-19th century, and it was a rival. The Scottish Episcopalian Church was growing in the mid-19th century, and people were walking out from the kirk over to the Episcopalian Church that had organs, choirs, and much more adorned liturgy. And so there was a lot of rivalry developing. Those were the reasons. One was theological, but the other ones were not necessarily as theological. And so the idea came that the General Assembly would tolerate organs in churches, and organs could be used according to the dictates of congregations and presbyteries. But then came the problem. Where do you put the organ, especially if it has pipes? And so another argument arose in the Scottish Kirk, and that was the pipes must not become the focal point of the worship building, because the pulpit is to be the focal point, not the organ pipes. So they thought they solved one controversy, and lo and behold, a second controversy began to arise. Now, I should tell you the name of the man who was fighting against all of this. It was the son of James Beggs Sr., who fought against the table. James Begg Jr., he was the one who began fighting against this, and he wrote a very long treatise against the organ. And eventually, of course, he was put in one sense silenced by those who took a different position. Now the third one, from plain to adorned liturgy. The Scottish Presbyterians and Ulster Presbyterians had a very plain liturgical service. By plain, I mean it's not elaborate, it's not decorated at all, it's not ornamented, it's simple, it's ordinary, it's puritanical, very much. It's plain. What do I mean by an adorned liturgy? Well, if you look in the definition, it simply means to decorate that which is plain. To decorate that which is plain, to enliven it, to add something to it. And the Presbyterians, for basically 200 to 300 years, had followed a very plain tradition. But there was a problem. If you go back to Knox, it wasn't exactly a plain liturgy. The plain liturgy crept in over time. And in the 19th century, there were some very astute church historians who began to say, you're misrepresenting church history. There is another side to this story of the liturgy of Presbyterianism. And so in mid-19th century, amongst Presbyterians, there were rumblings for reform of worship, revitalization of worship, return to Knox's tradition of worship, and to go back to Knox's liturgies. Secondly, there was also this idea that we should recover the best of the ancient church and of the Catholic Church. There was a sense of romanticism that began to creep in, philosophically, one could say. Who were the people that were leading this movement? Professor Cooper and Thomas Leishman, Principal Story, and the name that I want you to remember tonight, Reverend George Washington Sprott, S-P-R-O-T-T, Dr. Sprott. He was the leader of this movement as an editor, writer, lecturer, and he was arguing such things as the following. Worship should be adorned by the use of including the Apostles' Creed, as John Knox did. We should say the Lord's Prayer, as John Knox did. We should have more frequent communion. It should not just be once a year. We should also have communion at General Assembly. And we should add the 5 Christian Dominical feast, the advent of Jesus, the Good Friday, Easter, Pentecost, and Ascension. And it is not wrong to include occasionally written prayers, such as a prayer of confession of sin. It is not wrong. These are the heritage of the Reformed Church. Well, this was a controversy that was probably more significant in many ways than the first two, because it was a major shift from the plain puritanical style that had developed in 1645 through to the 1860s. And Sprott was the leader. Now, Sprott is of great interest here for us, I think, because George Washington Sprott was a Nova Scotian. He was born in the Musquodoboit Valley in 1829, about where Middle Musquodoboit is in Nova Scotia. And I think we might have a photo of him in a moment there, or of the area of Musquodoboit there. His father was a Seceder minister, and as a Seceder minister, he had been from Galloway, that area, so he was also a Covenanter background. George was born there, and he went off to Glasgow University to study, came back, and he became the Church of Scotland minister at St. Matthew's in Halifax, the Kirk. He married a Haligonian lady, and then after that, he went back to Scotland, where he served as a chaplain overseas, and then returned to Scotland. Now, 1865, he had been writing some material, and people became interested in what he was writing, and he helped found a society called the Church Service Society. That society would lead to the revolution of Presbyterian worship from plain to adorned. And it was all because of one book. This book, and you say, well, it looks rather dull. It was known as the Book of Common Order, but it had a Greek name, the Eulokion, which means the collection of prayers, 2 Greek words put together. This book was the first book that had been published in Scotland about how to worship in a Presbyterian church since the days of John Knox. This book went through 11 editions from the 1860s to 1924. Virtually every Church of Scotland minister would purchase one of these during that time period, and they were returning to an older tradition, not the Puritan tradition, but the Knoxonian tradition and an older tradition. So this book by Sprott was of great significance. His name isn't there, but he's the editor. Eulokion, Book of Common Order, being forms of prayers and administration, sacraments, and other ordinance of the church. It's a very significant work. Now, why is it significant here in Atlantic Canada? Well, because Sprott, of course, was a maritimer who did it. But there's more to it. In 1879, after church union took place in Canada in 1875, Sprott is sent to Canada by the Church of Scotland General Assembly to do a tour in the Dominion, in the Presbyterian churches and colleges. During that tour, he will be speaking about this book. Copies are printed and sold throughout the Dominion. It will become the foundation text for Presbyterian ministers conducting worship services from the 1870s to the 1920s. This is where things are significant. The shift then will begin. There will be agitation in the 1890s. Why can't we say the Apostles' Creed? Why is it wrong to say the Lord's Prayer? And so the shift will start to take place, and the Lord's Prayer will be said in Presbyterian churches. The Apostles' Creed will be said, and Christmas will be celebrated. Good Friday. The shift is taking place, and it's the power of this book. And he did his tour in maritime Canada. I do not know, and I'm still waiting to try to find some digging on this, if he toured the island here or not. I can't tell you, because most of his family were in Nova Scotia, so I'm not sure if he came over here to speak or not. But it's that tour. He eventually was made the lecturer in worship at the 4 Scottish universities in the faculties of theology. So when he would go there to worship and to teach in Glasgow, Aberdeen, St. Andrews, and Edinburgh, he was teaching the Eulocolean. And as he was teaching that, he continued to emphasize all of those things. So he, in many ways, is the great motivator. The last chapter of his textbook that he used in his lectures for the Scottish universities deals with church architecture. So he moves from liturgics to church architecture. And that architectural movement I can summarize in the next, as we go back to the various movements that he's going to do. So we've gone through the liturgy, let's go through the architecture now. The built space in this 100-year period is going to shift radically. The first shift, of course, is going to be long tables need massive wide aisles at the front or at the back, somewhere or along. But if you only have a short table, you can change the way you design and configure your interior building. So it's going to affect architecture. Number 2, we're going to go from a central high pulpit to either a platform or a chancel pulpit. There are basically 3 or 4 types of pulpits in Presbyterian churches, and I'll show you pictures of those. There is the huge high pulpit that takes 7 stairs to ascend on either side, usually, so that you're at the eye level of the people in the first row of the gallery. That's the high pulpit. Go to St. Andrews in Quebec City, you will see an original one in Lower Canada. Or you will go to a platform, which is a wide platform, so that the preacher is allowed some room to walk when he preaches. Or there's a chancel pulpit that is confining, that reminds you of the old high pulpit, but is to one side of the church. Those are the 3. Architecture and liturgy become connected. 3, you move from long tables to a short table or the box table. Sorry, I misread there. The long wall, short wall. This is the short wall, that's the long wall. The majority of Scottish churches up through to the 1860s, all pulpits were on the long wall, not the short wall. So, but there's going to be a liturgical change. So you begin to see how these flow together. Number 4, no organ, 2 organ. Those pipes are going to be, where do you put them? And the answer that Sprott and others said, put them in the west gallery so that you don't see them head on the short wall when you put the chancel pulpit or the platform pulpit at the front. So he had ideas on that as well. From outdoor communion to indoor only. Traditionally, when the Presbyterians met for communion once a year, the buildings couldn't contain the congregations. So they would remove the windows so that the preacher could be heard, but that didn't always work very well either. So what they would do is they would set up an outdoor pulpit called the preaching ark, and there would be a shelter, and there would be relays of tables there so that more people could be accommodated. For instance, in one Highland parish, 19 parishes gathered together for the one communion service. Now, how do you accommodate 19 parishes in one parish? You don't. So built space becomes immaterial. You go outdoors. But it rains in Scotland, right? So that problem there, and in Cape Breton and wherever, so that becomes an issue. But what will happen in this 100-year period is the Presbyterians move indoors for communion, and outdoor communion stops. That is going to change the way they do their services for communion then. It's all going to happen with the short table. And 6, they will start to change the way they build their buildings in this 100-year period, starting right around 1850s to about 1900. Most Scottish churches were either a T-plan or a rectangle, but the rectangle was always, the long wall is your focal point. If your building is a T, you still have it at the one junction, the center, and then you would have the Laird's loft looking into the T section, main section. And then slowly something is going to happen called Gothic. And Presbyterians will start to embrace Gothic, but the myth is they don't embrace it completely. That's a mythic idea. Presbyterians never embrace Gothic 100%. Whenever you see Gothic, it is one style amongst many that Scots would continue to use. So those are the shifts that you can watch for when we illustrate it here. Next. Who was behind all these liturgical and spatial shifts? I've given you the key name of Sprott. It was happening in 2 established churches. It was happening in the Church of England, and it was happening in the Church of Scotland. And the 2 were taking place almost at the same time. The English were ahead of the Scots, and it was happening out of Oxford and Cambridge. If you were an Anglican, you would have heard of the Oxford movement and Tractarianism. Or you would have heard of the Cambridge-Camden Society, known as the Ecclesiological Society. And I'm not going to give much of all of these, but both of these movements, Oxford and Cambridge, were centered around Anglo-Catholicism, a return to the ancient church. They were concerned about recovering all that had been lost before the Reformation. And furthermore, they were concerned with there is only one style of church architecture for them, the Gothic. And so they will advocate that as part of that movement very much. As you know, here in Charlottetown, Oxford was just down the road over here at St. Peter's. That's Tractarian. St. Paul's was known as the Low Church. So 2 very different Anglican traditions. In the Church of Scotland, it was Sprott and others who created these 2 societies. And the 2 societies ran in conjunction with the General Assembly, but independent of the General Assembly. And it was a Scottish tradition to have societies that functioned parallel to the society, but not exactly under the assembly. The Church Service Society and the Scottish Church Society were those 2 that were involved in that, and they became the noteworthy ones. So these were the great shifts, and these were the people doing it. Now, we can just look at a few illustrations. I've given you a little bit on Sprott there. Now let's go for a little tour to lighten things up a little. A few things on church architecture. The first great name of this shift in church architecture that you can see right in this building right here, in some ways, goes back to Augustus Pugin, who came from French-Swiss background, though his father adopted England as his home. He is the main driver behind this Gothic revival movement in the United Kingdom. And he wrote a very famous work that we'll just mention briefly. The next name would be George Gilbert Scott, and he was a promoter of the Gothic revival, especially in Scotland and in England, and so he's another name. R.R. Anderson, another Scottish Gothic revivalist, and then the last one, P. Mackintosh Chalmers was the last one. Those are the four names, so if you're really into wanting to study Gothic architecture, particularly as it was transmitted from Pugin in England and Scott to Anderson and Chalmers, those are the key names you would need to know. Now, just a little bit about Pugin here, we'll give you the four styles of pulpit, just so that you can see them. You've probably been there. If you've been to St. Andrews in New Brunswick, go to the Greenock Presbyterian Church. It's the finest of all the Scottish high pulpits left in Canada. It's a two-decker. You know what a two-decker pulpit is? The middle deck, see where the pulpit fall is? That is for the presenter to stand in, and he would stand there. The preacher would stand above him. Okay, so that's a double-decker, made out of some of the best imported wood, tremendous pulpit. Interesting, it's on the short wall, not the long wall, because there are perhaps some American influences there. Type number 2, right here in Charlottetown. Go over to Zion. Zion has a platform pulpit. You can see the platform, you can see it's very wide. What did I say a platform pulpit is great for? For revival preaching, for preachers who tend to like walking around, for crusade preaching, for that type of preaching. That became very prominent, the platform pulpit. That's known as an Akron-style platform pulpit there, named after where it came from in Akron. Third one, your church. And you can see the styles. This is a chancel pulpit, because it's to the side, either to the right or to the left, depending on configuration, and with a lectern on the other side. So all of a sudden, we've shifted, and now we've got Dr. Sprott, who's been influencing this in the Canadian Presbyterian churches to change direction from the long wall to the short wall, and to change from the high pulpit or the platform pulpit to the best pulpit, he would say, so that there could be involvement, reading, and proclamation, and the balance of the communion table, so that there is a center of word sacrament seen at once, as opposed to the Scottish Presbyterian churches where you saw a huge pulpit, no communion table generally, until the end of the century when the small table began to move in. So those are the three, but there's a fourth one. The preaching ark. That's the outdoor Presbyterian preaching pulpit. And that would be kept in someone's barn, and then it would be brought out. They were used on Prince Edward Island. They were used all over Cape Breton, and very common, brought out once a year for communion seasons. So if it was raining, the preacher could still go on. He could carry on. So I've never seen a preaching ark yet in Canada. There's one from the island of Islay, which is Kintyre Peninsula, off the Kintyre Peninsula. Beautiful painting there. That's a communion season, and I'm not sure what exactly that moment is there, but the artist is trying to capture that style there. Thank you. Okay. Now, let's just do a little wander so that you can be convinced that I didn't make all this up. Scotland, for about 300 years, this is the style of church. The Scots used to have a name for it, the barn church. What is a barn church? A barn church is usually a square or a rectangle with a T or something. It's not fancy. It's post and beam often, or it's stone, and it has 3 galleries and this massive pulpit, and there it is. Sorry for the image on that. It's not very good. You'll see some better ones. Here's one that is perfect to shape. This is what's called a parliament church. There are 43 parliamentary churches that were built in the Highlands, paid for by the government, and you could choose per village whether you wanted a 600-pound church or a 900-pound church. A 600-pound church meant you didn't get a tea. You didn't have the extra laird's loft. If you wanted the 900, you could get the extra loft that would give you more seats in the back. This is the Plockton Church. So there you are, there are the Highland churches. There you can see it with the T, and you can't see it very well, unfortunately, but you'll notice here the communion goes across the entire length of the church. So we would seat up to 50 people per serving. High, and there should be a two-decker if you had enough money by the laird to get the extra one. We'll show you some now. Here's the interior. Hasn't changed since 1820s. So just beautiful. There's the presenter's box. There is the preacher. He only gets one set of stairs, a little cheaper to build. Usually you have symmetry, but that's a bit Gothic, so they weren't concerned with that. And this is a three-sided gallery again, and this is a hinge communion table. You notice that? It goes all the way across because, again, the doors are on the side, not the entrance there. So you can just go through these. Here's another one. This is where some of my family were from in Sutherland, and same style. They got a bell coat, perfectly formed there, and beautiful inside. A little fancier wood, so the laird must have been willing to chip in a little above the 600 or 900, and just does it. You'll notice the communion table again is built in to the church, in between pews, the presenter's box, everything standard. Typical Scottish. Nothing Gothic about this at all. Long wall, high pulpit and long communion tables again. And this one, that's in Russia, same style, nothing new. Okay. And if you look at some of these designs, some of you have probably been to the island of Iona. If you've seen the parish church there, it's not the parish church that it was when it was built. It's been reconfigured. But most of the churches at that time all were the same, long communion tables, tall pulpits with presenter boxes. There you are, ready for communion. If you go to Iona today and you see the new Iona, there it is. Everything's been completely changed. You've got a mini chancel now on the short wall. You've got a box communion table, not a short table, but a box table. And you've got a complete reconfiguration. So that's Iona today. It's all changed, all part of that. This is one in Argyllshire. My wife's family are Campbells, so I can say this is her country. This is one of the finest examples of what you will see left in Scotland, because they're almost all gone. You will notice complete symmetry in the pulpit. You will see the stairs. You will see the preacher would be basically at eye level. You will see the presenter gets a beautiful box as well to stand in. So there it is. And you will see in the next slide the way the communion was done again. It was down the center aisle, but it was a permanent table the length of the entire church. So very long to take about 50 people at that church. So I didn't make this up. This is the way it was. Along comes the Gothic revival. But Scotland will reinterpret it in different ways from the English. The English will be pushing it towards the use of the word altar. That's not going to fly amongst Scots Presbyterians and Irish Presbyterians in Ulster. And so they will reinterpret that and say, no, we do not have an altar, but we are going to have a box table. It's still a table. And it will be a focal point of worship equal with the word, so that word and sacrament will balance. Before, the old Scottish churches usually did not have a font. The font was attached to the pulpit. There was a hoop, and on that hoop, the basin was placed. It was not very decorous. And so people said, it doesn't show word and sacrament visually to the people because it's not aesthetics, it's not symbolic. And the shift here will be word must have central place, so must the Lord's Supper, so must the font of baptism of entrance into the visible church. And so Gothic will be different in Scotland amongst the Presbyterians than it is amongst the Anglicans. Sometimes people will say, well, Gothic Presbyterianism is quasi-Anglican. Maybe, but it's not the same thing. It is a different focal point, and so that will be part of it. This is the man, as I've already said, introduced to you, Pugin. You can go back and read his two books, particularly on this. The first one is The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture. Now, you will notice he does not use the word or words Gothic revival, because he's using the literal idea and concept. What is Gothic? It is pointed architecture. It always must reach a focal point. So just look around here, this is full of Gothic pointedness. Secondly, notice his adjective, Christian architecture. Pugin, if you study him at all, you will realize that he says there is only one form of architecture that is acceptable for the Christian religion. All other styles are not acceptable. So he's very dogmatic. People like Anderson in Scotland and P.M. Chalmers are not dogmatic. They will use Gothic, but they will also use classical styles, revived, and they will also use Norman styles. So they do not buy in to the full Pugin ideology. He also writes a book called An Apology for the Revival of Christian Literature. So those are the key ideas that come from Pugin, and they will be interpreted differently by the Scottish Presbyterians and by the architects of Scottish and Dominion architects that will work for Presbyterian churches. There's a picture of a man who's sort of been a hero in architecture for me, Sir George Gilbert Scott. I was asked to write an article for him a few years ago for the Encyclopedia of Christian Civilization. There's a picture of Scott. That's his greatest work, I think, perhaps one of them in Scotland. It's Bute Hall at the University of Glasgow. And those of you for your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, they're all into Hogwarts. They're all into probably reading that. Well, Hogwarts is a rediscovery of Gothic revival. Yeah, of course, mixed with some other revival styles, but here you'll get this on pages, University of Glasgow, or is it Hogwarts? As an alumna of Glasgow, I sometimes say to myself, well, you just graduated from Hogwarts, that's all you did. So you didn't get very far. Anyhow, those were the things. But this revival would influence the churches. But many of the Scots would take that and they would make it baronial, or they would add elements that would change it to make it their own and distinctive styles. Here is one of the famous new Gothic churches that were built in the 1880s in Glasgow, Old Govan Parish Church. They ran out of money, so they didn't get the tower. You got the tower. They didn't. They never could afford it. It is a beautiful Gothic structure, and if you ever get to go inside it, go and see the Scandinavian hogsbacks. There is a row of them inside the church. Hogsbacks are a form of gravestone that are from Scandinavia that the Vikings introduced to the Scots. Here's the interior, a great interior. Now, let's just read that for a moment. Here is Scottish reinterpretation of Gothic architecture. You have to have the arches, of course, pointed. Pugin would say, every time you look at a Gothic arch, you should study the magnificence of the Trinity. Because you see, for Pugin, architecture was a spiritual, mystical experience. Whether or not you might say, I don't quite see that, but that's how it was for him. You will see those arches, so that's the key. You see the perpendicularity of everything. You see that it moves towards the communion table, which is a box. You will see that this one has the high pulpit or the chancel pulpit on the right. Now, there was a reason, because they had limited space with their reconfiguration of the old buildings, so they had to have the gallery on the opposite side, so they had to put the lectern opposite to what you see here this evening. So they had to play around with pure Gothic styles a little bit. You will notice, though, that behind there, all the series of arches there, the Gothic points behind, of course, the communion table. What does that make you think of here this evening? Because often that would be where the elders would all sit, and they'd be seated around there, or a choir. They did not put the choir there. That was reserved for the elders. The choir would sit out in front often. Sometimes they would be allowed in. There have been some reconfigurations there. So it's reconfigured to meet the Scottish Presbyterian theological atmosphere, not the Anglican or Church of England. If any of you are interested, there's a name that you can go and read. His name is Nigel Yates. He wrote two very fine works, Preaching Word and Sacrament, Scottish Church Interiors. And he was one of my examiners for my PhD, and afterwards we became acquainted and we started working together on some projects. Those are the two key books that he produced, Preaching Word and Sacrament, Scottish Church Interiors, and Liturgical Space. If any of you are interested, that's where you can sort of learn about how Presbyterians and Anglicans sort of changed their liturgies and also changed their space as they went along. That brings us towards the end. Brings us right here. And it allows us then to look at this building just for a few minutes as we conclude. 1898, circa, the photo here, the one that you see over here as well. You see the elements. This is a Gothic revival church. Now, there are all kinds of Gothic revival churches on Prince Edward Island. And you say, oh, that's a Gothic revival church because it has Gothic windows. But as soon as you go inside, there's nothing Gothic about the interior. It becomes classical, or it becomes diverse or vernacular. But when you see a church that actually brings the Gothic into the interior, you actually know that you're probably dealing with a later period, because the early Gothic influences just were off on the outside. But when you go on the inside of the later churches, such as this, 1870s, you see that the Gothic comes inside, not just on the outside of the building. And so you can see that. But it's still a transitional building. And so the heritage here of St. James is absolutely amazing, because it represents a building that is true to the old Scottish Presbyterian designs of building that were standard for 300 years. The pulpit on the long wall, a three-sided gallery around it, and an elevated central pulpit as the focal point of worship. Because the worship experience is auditory, it is very much intellectual, spiritual, but it is to be heard, the voice of proclamation. Yet, we're in the 1870s to the 1930s, and we're going to see a transition. a Gothic building that is going to go from that Scottish Gothic interior towards the Sprott design and motif that was emerging in Scotland, that was being popularized in Scotland and in the Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, including that, and also Canada. And as that influence came, the shift from the long wall to the short wall immediately took place. But with that shift was this idea that word and sacrament had to balance each other, that the auditory had to also express a more frequent understanding of communion, and with a visible presentation of seeing the font nearby. It is that sense of shift that you see taking place. So the heritage of this building is actually a very complex motif of seeing several design factors and interior design factors of Scottish architecture being woven together in this context over time to see not a quasi-Anglican tradition, but a tradition that was in keeping with adorned Presbyterian liturgy that was developing in the 1890s through the 1920s. And hence, your reconfiguration fits very nicely with that time. Now, there are a lot of challenges. The first challenge is, do you knock that wall out and you put a deep chancel back there? Well, if you do that, the building's going to become extremely cathedral length. And so obviously they chose not to do that, but to remove the gallery and to create a unique styled chancel through paneling with the pointed arch, declaring itself, Gothic revival, fitting with all the points and the arches to make it unified. But it's very unique because the chancel then has different space configurations on either side of it. So it makes it unique. It has the typical 3 steps up, and then it allows for the choir on either side, and it moves the organ here. And so the organ comes out of the gallery, as does the choir, and you can see that configuration. Because it was always this question, where do we put the organ? Where do we put the pipes? Does it become central? Those things. So this is an amazing building because it speaks to us of years of change that were going on amongst many different architects, many different liturgists, different theological schools of thought that were emerging. And it shows us the shift from, of course, the long wall to the short wall. It shows us the shift from long tables that were perhaps never used here, or may have been, I'm not sure, to very much the short box table. And it also shows us the shift to a more adorned liturgy, where there is a cross in the church on the table, where there is a sense that there can be movement, where there are the seasons and the 5 domicile seasons of the church calendar, where there would be a liturgy that would be more 1890s rather than, say, 1690. So those changes are represented also in the built space and coming inside the space. Now, next week, you get to have, or not next week, but next month, the church's people. And it made me think, of course, what we were taught in Sunday school and Vacation Bible School. The church, there's, with the steeple, and there's the people inside. Here it is. You're going to go from the building to the church's people. And so the talk that will be presented by Ian and Joan in November the 2nd will talk about significant people and events in Kirk history. So in a sense, what we have been doing last week and this week is talking about the church as its organic framework, its denominations and its tributaries, its streams, its unions. We've been talking a little more about the church and its built space or even non-built space. And we're talking about how that will impact worship. But what we are missing are those narratives, the stories of the people who will be inside that church. And so, all the best, and it's just fitting that you can talk about those significant people events in Kirk history here at St. James on the 2nd of November. So thank you very much. And if there are a couple of questions or so, feel free. We can take those. Yes.
You had mentioned about a box table. Was it actually a square? What is the difference between a long table and a box table?
Okay. This is a box table because typically a table is open. The PowerPoint projector is sitting on a table. And if you think about it, most communion tables that we're, say, often see, in front of a pulpit, say in a platform building, is just 4 legs. The box table allowed for elaborate designs. It allows for craftsmanship. I'll think a little bit here of arts and crafts, think a little bit of the romanticism of the Gothic movement as opposed to industrialization and fast production. Slow things down to have care, but also to show beauty. So when you look at the carving, you look at the manufacture, you look at the dentillation, you sort of say, that's a work of beauty. And so the box communion table was sort of representative of that flow of the romantic, of the arts and crafts, of the Gothic revival. It blends different things depending on what you're looking at there. So that's the style that's here. It's a box table. Okay.
And I guess I have another question in that is, how does stained glass fit with Presbyterianism?
Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Very good question. How does stained glass sort of fit with Presbyterianism? At first, in the 1550s, some stained glass was destroyed and removed from some of the churches. Not all of it. And it was viewed as icons and that type of thing, so it was downplayed. And that happened and basically lasted for about 300 years. Again, during this period, 1820s to 1920s, the shift returned from plain glass, leaded but plain, to colored glass, and then to the rediscovery of stained glass. So that shift took place. And the shift also took place around, can a picture of Jesus now be allowed? And as the emphasis returned to the incarnation, that Christ was incarnate, then it's interesting that that also led to incarnate imagery starting to be used. So the two seem to go together here. It's remained somewhat of a controversy. Now, if you go back and read Pugin, of course, was basing all his ideas from the 12th century in Saint Denis, in France mainly, and he was going back to that, and where the idea is that glass creates beauty and light, and it takes us into the presence of God, it brings us to God. And that when there are colors and they create designs, and that it's a sense of beauty, it's a sense of harmony, it's a sense of this is the glory of God because He is at work. So Pugin, he was able to look at stained glass and say, I have a theology of stained glass, which is somewhat mystical, hence it's a Gothic soul, and he could create that type of anesthetic, of that type of, aesthetic. The Scots, some of them did that, some of them didn't, and there was a debate, and it's never been quite settled amongst Presbyterians on this, but the majority of them moved towards just harmonizing it in their Gothic churches. However, in some of their classic-oriented churches that continue to be built, they only use colored glass and refrain from using stained glass icons and that type of thing. So there's been some variety in that. But good question. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned that the Presbyterians, the more traditional kind in Scotland, only use 12 hymn tunes. Is that just an exaggeration, or was there once everybody had it down?
12 hymn tunes.
Sorry. Okay. Just not catching that one. Sorry very much, Stephanie.
I'll just kind of try to repeat the question if I can. So you're asking about the 12 hymn tunes, why there were only 12? Is that your question?
I didn't realize that was ever a fact, and I guess we have 800 now.
You're just commenting that we have 800 hymns now, and were there only 12 at one time?
Yes. Okay. It was 12 tunes, and the tunes were limited to the 150 psalms, so you could change those tunes. So it led to very little variety in singing. And in the 1860s in particular, people were getting a bit tired of this, because they were starting to travel around, and as they traveled around, they started to hear more tunes in other churches. And, you know, as you travel, you discover things, and then you bring it back home. And so that was one reason to actually start to bring organs into the building. Because as you got more tunes, they became more elaborate. And if the tunes are becoming more elaborate, it's more difficult for the presenter to do an elaborate tune that isn't common meter. So you need an instrument, hence the organ, better even than the harmonium. And so the two sort of happened at the same time. There was some dissatisfaction with the old tunes. They wanted new, but they were too complicated, so you needed an instrument. And then they just continued to produce them. And they also were tired of the old lining Scottish tradition. And that was now going by the wayside, because it was cumbersome in worship, and it took so long to get through a psalm to sing when you had to do it twice, you know, once by the presenter, once by the congregation. It can take a long time. So that shift was there. And then Scots finally started composing hymns at a rapid rate. Now, I don't want to deviate too much, but Scots had been composing hymns in Gaelic for a long time, and they were singing them, but they weren't allowed to sing them in the hour of solemn worship. But they could sing a Gaelic hymn, which might have 30 stanzas to it, by the way. And they could sing it in home, or they could sing it out in the moors, or they could sing it, you know, in the highlands. But you couldn't sing it in the building while you gathered for worship. So the Scots had a hymn tradition, but it was a hymn tradition that was outside of the doors of the church. And what began to happen in the 1860s were people were saying, let's bring the hymn into the church. And that, of course, was along with the organ, and it was a controversy with that. But the argument was, we saw that the Scottish Presbyterians of John Knox were singing things that were not in the Bible. Well, if John Knox could sing something that wasn't necessarily in the Bible, what about us? So there was these controversies that were emerging. The 19th century had a lot of theological controversies within Presbyterianism. That's why the streams kept on taking so long to get together to unite, because there were always these issues. Yes. Good. Thank you.
So much, Dr. Whytock, for that. Very fascinating. I think we just really whet our appetites, that there's so much to know and so much to learn, and great to use our own sanctuary as an example of some of these major changes. And I do have a token of appreciation for you this evening. So next up this month, in terms of our 200th anniversary celebrations, will be our anniversary weekend on October 18th and 19th. So we'll remind people of the gala concert that will be taking place here in the sanctuary, where it'll be festooned and decorated with lots of tartan, and that will be Saturday evening at 7 o'clock on October 18th, followed on the 19th by our special worship service at which Reverend Geoffrey Murray, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, will be our guest speaker. And at that time, we'll also be dedicating a plaque to commemorate the 200th anniversary of our congregation. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the evening, and we'll hope to see you in November when the final two of these Heritage Talks will take place. Thank you.